Greetings, VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this news update. It's been another eventful week here in Israel, and of course, the main event is that we're celebrating Passover and the week of unleavened bread. Of course, the war isn't taking any breaks, and we've had incoming missiles, outgoing airstrikes, and plenty of action on the ground in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. Because this is Israel, we also had a political scandal, mixed economic news, protests in the streets, and an unprecedented movement by IDF reservists who are calling for an end to the fighting and a deal with Hamas to get the hostages back, and we need them back. All that and more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Well, let's start this week's report with the big news, and that is that we are in the week of Passover and Unleavened Bread. This appointed time of the Lord is meant to serve as a reminder to the people of God how it all started, the covenant he made with the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. And by the way, I was born in a hospital in Detroit called Mount Sinai Hospital. And of course, the events that led up to that are chronicled in the book of Exodus. For this reason, we have a Seder meal, and Seder again means order, on the first evening of Passover, which includes a ritualistic telling of the Exodus story from the Haggadah. Sadly, in modern Israel and in much of Jewish diaspora as well, the central element of Passover, the lamb, is at best an afterthought, if not absent entirely. The blood which God commanded the Israelites to put on the doorposts and lintel of their homes so the angel of death would pass over the house and not take the firstborn sons that were in that house, is also barely an afterthought in the modern Jewish observance of this biblical feast. With that in mind, may I ask you to join me in praying that God will open the eyes of the Jewish people and also in your families as well, so that they will see the Lamb who was slain for all of us, and the blood of the Lamb, which is the only way any of us can be saved from the judgment of a righteous and holy God. The Passover season is a time when we can and should talk to our Jewish friends and neighbors about these things. And it's never a bad time to pray into these issues. And I'm praying for your families as well. Now, moving on to some of the less cheerful but still very important news items this week. On Sunday evening, residents of Jerusalem and many other communities in central Israel were sent running to their bomb shelters as a ballistic missile was fired at Israel by the Houthis in Yemen. Who else? Interceptor missiles were fired by both the Arrow 3 system of Israel, which is operated by the IDF, and the THAAD system, which is operated by U.S. troops stationed in Israel. There are, at the moment, 2 THAAD systems deployed here in Israel, each of which is crewed by several dozen U.S. troops. This is because of the possibility of a large-scale ballistic missile attack from Iran, such as we had a year ago this week in April of 2024, and again in October of last year. Now, that second barrage in October was the largest ballistic missile attack in history, and it managed to do some damage to one of our air bases in southern Israel. And I heard a few buildings and cars were damaged by debris from intercepted missiles here and there. One Palestinian man was also killed near Jericho when a large fragment of a missile fell on him. But other than that, there were no casualties from that attack. Thank God. What a miracle it was. But several rockets were also fired at Gaza Strip envelope communities from within the Strip. It seems incredible that after 18 months of war, the terrorist groups in Gaza still have rockets to shoot at us, but it's true. This threat has not gone away at all. Now, while we're on the subject of Gaza, I need to tell you very briefly about what's going on there. The IDF has taken control of the Morag Corridor, a line of control north of Rafah and south of Khan Yunis, bisecting the Gaza Strip and creating a buffer zone between Rafah, which is on the Egyptian border, and the rest of the cities in central and northern Gaza. IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir says that the goal here is to prevent the smuggling to weapons and other contraband from Egypt, of which the Egyptians on the other side are making millions of dollars from Hamas and terror groups. Now, it's being smuggled into Rafah and to the rest of the Strip. But Zamir also said publicly on Monday that he cannot carry out a plan to fully take control of the Strip because he simply doesn't have enough available soldiers to do that. Between the need for the IDF to continue deploying large forces on other fronts and the continued refusal of Israel's ultra-Orthodox community to allow its young men to be drafted. There just aren't enough warm bodies for all the places they are needed. And I, for one, am all for the IDF drafting the ultra-Orthodox young men. As difficult as that is, the IDF's manpower problems might be about to get worse, because there is a growing movement of both regular forces and reservists to say enough is enough, we're not going to do this anymore. After 18 months of fighting, the longest sustained conflict in Israel's history, some reservists have been mobilized for as much as 500 days. That's 500 days straight, with a few breaks to go home and visit their families here and there. Divorce rates are up, and are the numbers of children who are having problems at school, as well as drugs abuse and other things. Many jobs have disappeared, and small businesses have been forced to close. This great sacrifice has made and continues to be made, and many reservists are saying they just can't do it anymore. On top of that, there is a growing sense that there is not much left to be gained by fighting, and the time has come to make a deal with Hamas to secure the release of the remaining hostages. I want the hostages back as much as anyone, and there's reason to hope that this sustained military pressure on Hamas is causing them to be more flexible in negotiations. I don't know, because they lie all the time. We got some mixed signals on that front this week, and I won't even go into detail about that because the details keep changing. But even to the degree that this might be going according to plan, it's coming at a horrible price. And the political leadership needs to do some hard thinking about that. There is another consideration, and that is the tremendous amount of time, effort, resources, and attention this ongoing ground operation in Gaza is taking away from the IDF's necessary preparations to meet other challenges. In fact, as I said before, the main event in terms of incoming rockets and missiles might yet be to come, and I'll explain why. On Saturday, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Oman on Saturday. The direct contacts were brief, according to reports, and they were followed by indirect negotiations in which the American team was in one room and the Iranian team was in another room while they communicated with each other through texts sent to an Omani intermediary. How funny. If this sounds a little bizarre to you, that's the way it had to be so that no one would lose face. President Trump had insisted on direct negotiations while the Iranians had insisted on indirect negotiations just to show that they wouldn't be bullied. And this was the compromise result that was worked out so both sides could say they got what they wanted and didn't back down to the other side. International relations are like that sometimes. Even between friends and enemies, it's like that. But President Trump's willingness to make this cosmetic concession shouldn't be interpreted as a sign that he's willing to put up with much more. He has declared that the talks must produce an agreement that he can live with in 60 days. And he has made it clear that if this doesn't happen, he'll launch the strikes. In a related statement, senior administration officials have said that Israel will actually take the lead in planning these attacks and executing them if that's what becomes necessary. Iran, for its part, has threatened to launch a massive strike on Israel, perhaps using hypersonic ballistic missiles, although I'm not so sure how many of those they really have since they only publicly unveiled their first example of one in mid-2023. It takes time and resources to build a large stockpile of any kind of weapon, so I'm somewhat skeptical about reports that Iran has thousands or even hundreds of hypersonic missiles to fire at us. Also, we've already seen that Israel's defense systems are capable of defending against the older and slower ballistic and cruise missiles and long-range drones that Iran has in its arsenal. There is also the possibility that whatever is left of the Houthis would also fire whatever they can at us in coordination with the Iranians. But maybe not, as Iran has pulled its military advisors out of Yemen, abandoning the Houthis to their fate as the Americans continue bombing them, and the internationally recognized government of Yemen has announced a plan to form an army of around 80,000 fighters and try to take back the main cities from the Houthis. But whatever might come of all of this, the fact is that Israelis are under the threat of bombardment, And whether it's hypersonic missiles from Iran, or ballistic missiles from Yemen, artillery rockets or other rockets from Hamas and Gaza, and whatever Hezbollah and Lebanon might have left to try and fire at us, Israelis have a last line of defense, and that's sheltered spaces. Here at Vision for Israel, we're still providing portable bomb safety shelters to public venues like schools, bus stops, community centers, and sporting facilities in order to give people who are caught out in the open during an alert a place to run to, a shelter. Here is a short video about this vitally important project. Let's watch it together. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. In Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, everybody, and I want to stay on the topic of kinetic defense of Israel for just a moment and give you a brief update on the situation in the northern arena. There is some good news to report out of Lebanon, where Hezbollah has been substantially weakened, and over the past week, there are even reports that the Lebanese National Army has taken over nearly 2/3 of the bases and fighting positions south of the Litani River that were formerly occupied by Hezbollah. That is very good news for both Israel and Lebanon. And it's also worth remembering that this was one of the conditions set by UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that ended the Second Lebanon War in 2006, almost 20 years ago, and the UN didn't do a very good job. To this can be added an announcement on Monday that Lebanon's internationally recognized government is interested in returning to the 1949 armistice lines, which is another hopeful indication that they are ready to end the long-standing state of conflict between Lebanon and Israel. But there's two other pieces of news about Lebanon to report this week, one very cheerful and the other less so. The cheerful news is that the law enforcement agencies in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Spain announced over the last few days that they have wrapped up a nearly year-long operation meant to break up smuggling rings that sent dual-use equipment to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, these dual-use items were primarily drones, of a type that you often see at sporting events, taking aerial pictures of the crowd, or maybe people use them to film themselves or their friends climbing a mountain or taking a canoe down the river or whatever. But these drones can also be used to carry several kilograms of explosives over a long distance, and in recent wars in the Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere, they've been used by all sides as miniature kamikazes, delivering small but lethal explosive packages through windows into houses, into trenches, and even right inside the hatches of tanks. There are dozens of videos on YouTube of multi-million-dollar Russian tanks being taken out by small drones like these, carrying explosive charges and being flown inside the tanks by Ukrainian remote control operators miles away. Hezbollah must have watched those videos because they attempted to buy thousands of these drones in Europe and smuggle them into Lebanon so that they could use them against the IDF. But they won't be doing that anymore, at least not for the immediate future. These smuggling routes have been shut down, and both Israel and Europe are a lot safer for it. The less cheerful news is that Iran has nonetheless reopened smuggling routes for more old-fashioned types of weapons to be smuggled to Hezbollah via the port in Beirut. Remember the port that blew up some years back? Well, one can hope that the newfound courage of Lebanon's National Army to confront Hezbollah leads them to shut down this new old problem. If they don't or can't, then Israel might have to do it for them. I think it would be better if the Lebanese did it themselves than Israel having to do it. Moving on to quickly take a look at two other related issues on Israel's borders. In Syria, the Turkish army is continuing to occupy almost 1/5 of the country. Primarily in the north, while Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan seldom misses an opportunity to criticize Israel for setting up a buffer zone between the Golan Heights border and the southern outskirts of Damascus. This hypocrisy is largely ignored by the rest of the world. World, where are you at? Well, it raises some troubling questions, but we'll leave that for another time. For now, it's important to note that these Turkish forces are not leaving Syrian territory, and in fact, Erdogan makes no secret of his desire to move them even further south. If these forces keep inching south and the IDF forces deployed in the buffer zone south of Damascus simply don't back out, then sooner or later there's going to be direct contact and even friction between these forces. There is already a possibility that Turkish and Israeli aircraft could have occasion to meet in the airspace over Syria, and that could be problematic of and by itself. So that's what's going on up north. Down south on Israel's border with the Egyptian Sinai, there is also trouble brewing, and it's not beer. The Egyptian army is deploying large numbers of troops, tanks, artillery, and other weapons to this area. As I said last week, this is a violation of the 1979 Camp David Accords peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. Although the ostensible reason is to fight terrorism in Sinai, the training and equipment these Egyptian troops are demonstrating is much more indicative of preparations for a confrontation with the IDF than with ISIS. What both of these situations have in common is that there are diplomatic channels open between Israel and Turkey and between Israel and Egypt, and that are being facilitated by the Americans. That's all well and good, but the fact is that a long-term trend is happening, and Washington is not known for having long-term patience for managing long-term problems. I'm not confident that these problems will not get out of hand sooner or later. In fact, when I read Ezekiel 38 to 39, like I advised you to do so in last week's report, I find it difficult to imagine that this won't get out of hand sooner or later. These prophetic chapters don't say anything about Israel being saved by America, but God is mentioned as miraculously intervening in the situation to save Israel. Thank you, God. That's important to remember as we pray into this dangerous situation. Now moving on to another dangerous situation. The Iranian effort to undermine the Hashemite kingdom in Jordan and also train, fund, and arm terrorist groups and criminal gangs in Judea and Samaria has not stopped. The IDF, Shin Bet, and border police have been vigorously going after these guys and have had many successes. But as I said, Iran is pouring tremendous resources into this project. We need to bankrupt them, President Trump. That makes sense since they've lost their other proxy forces in Lebanon and Syria, so they don't have much left to harass Israel with besides these armed groups in Judea and Samaria. So once again, I'll ask you to join us in prayer about this issue. There is no lack of things to pray for Israel, as you can see. Now we're coming near to the end of the report for this week, so I'm just going to run through some other big stories from the past week and then conclude with some commentary. The High Court of Justice ruled that Prime Minister Netanyahu can't fire Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar after all. I'd also like to update you about the so-called Qatargate situation involving aides to Netanyahu accepting money from Qatar to try and improve that country's image in Israel. But this story has almost completely disappeared from the media. I'm not sure if that's because the gag order on the story has been tightened up or what's going on, but one thing I'm quite sure of is that the issue hasn't been settled. So I'm sure we'll hear more about it sooner or later. Another story that hasn't disappeared is Netanyahu's ongoing trial on charges of corruption, fraud, and breach of trust. Netanyahu's testimony in these trials has been constantly interrupted in the last few weeks by his unavoidable duties as prime minister. I know this is new for some of you out there. Now, I'm sure he's not sorry about that, but the fact is, sooner or later, one way or another, he's going to be back in the courtrooms and have to continue answering difficult questions from the prosecutors. It is almost surreal that this is happening in the middle of a war and all this other chaos happening, but democracy is not always easy, as we see here and elsewhere in the world. While all of this is going on, Israelis continue to regularly hold demonstrations in the streets, both for and against the policies of this current government. Some of the largest protests against the policies are being led by families of hostages. Remember what I said before about how some IDF reservists are voicing their opposition to continued fighting and in favor of coming to an agreement with Hamas to get the hostages back? Well, many families and released hostages agree with this settlement, and they're not staying quiet about it. Don't forget, the 24 living hostages and the remaining dead are all considered part of the whole family of hostages that we want to bring back to Israel. Now, other protests continue against the governing coalition's plans to push through judicial reform legislation. And some people are demonstrating to demand that the ultra-Orthodox start drafting into the IDF like everyone else, while the ultra-Orthodox can always be counted on to demonstrate against this idea and so on and so forth. I'm for them being drafted. Well, it's hard to keep track of all the things Israelis are unhappy about these days, although ironically enough, the Global Happiness Index was published this last week, and Israel once again ranked as the 8th happiest country in the world. Don't worry, be happy, to the amazement of everyone, including ourselves. Speaking of happiness, there's good and bad news on the economy this week, but I don't even want to get into it because, candidly, the good news is mostly cosmetic, while the bad news is much more concrete. It would require an entire other video to go through it all, but the bottom line is that the entire global economy is in chaos and likely headed for a downturn, and Israel is not in a good position to weather this storm well. That's why here at Vision for Israel, we're continuing with projects to provide assistance where it's most needed. Here is a short video about some of our projects, and I encourage you to write me at info@visionforisrael.com. that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Now, I want to make a brief comment to wrap up this week's report and tie all these stories together, because there is a connection. Israel is the world's 8th happiest country. See? Despite the ongoing war, social and political unrest, looming economic turmoil, and myriad of other problems. The reason is not as difficult to figure out as you might think. It's because Israeli families and our sense of communal life remain strong, and that's what human beings really need more than money and material possessions. Money isn't nothing, to be sure, but it's not everything either. In Israel, the rhythm of life is anchored in and centered around family and communal traditions. The Passover holiday is certainly one of those traditions, and even families that are not religiously observant have Seder meals together and otherwise partake in the traditions. To all our viewers in the United States, the United Kingdom, and all around the world on all the continents that ranked far lower in the World Happiness Index than Israel did, I submit to you that this is what you need. Stop working so hard to earn money to buy things that will never make you happy, and instead invest your time and whatever money you have in your family and community. God set this world He created up to be that way. And it's because He loves us and wants what's best for us, as a loving Father always does. Now, on that note, we've come to the conclusion of the report, and I want to continue the tradition of ending with some good news. It comes to us from the sports page, as the Hapoel Tel Aviv basketball team won the Euro Cup final in the Canary Islands on Friday evening. It was their first title in 52 years, and they made all Israelis proud. Now, I just want to also give a little hors d'oeuvre advice to all of you celebrating Passover. This is a little bit of charoset on a little piece of matzah that my wife gave me, and charoset is on the traditional Seder plate. It's made up of a mixture of dates, apples, honey, whatever, and here goes. One for me and one for you. Until next week, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of the VFI News from Israel. Shalom, shalom.